The diploma has not arrived. It has been 24 years, and the diploma has not arrived. Dieguez knows the exact dimensions of the object he is waiting for. Two bronze tablets bolted together stamped with the emperor's name, small enough to hold in one hand and heavy enough to change everything. He has seen other men receive theirs. He watched a Gallic infantryman named Caius fold his into a leather wrap and walk away from the Rhine without looking back. That was 3 years ago. Dieguez is still here. The river is still cold. The trumpet still sounds at the same hour it has sounded every morning for 2 decades. And somewhere in a wooden box in the headquarters building, 40 paces away, his name may already be inscribed on bronze that has not yet been handed to him. He walks past that building every morning on gate duty. He has learned not to slow his pace when he passes it. He has learned not to look at the door. 24 years. He enlisted at 18 in a Thracian village whose name he still remembers, but whose face he can no longer quite reconstruct. He signed a document he only partially understood, written in a language he was still learning. A recruiter with clean hands and clean teeth explained the term of service, the pay scale, the conditions. Dieguez nodded. He was 18. He had nothing. Rome was offering something. He signed. Now he is 42 years old. He has marched through 3 provinces. He has stood in formations that held and formations that broke. He has buried men whose names he knew better than his own relatives. He has a companion named Zia, a Germanic woman from the civilian settlement outside the fort walls, and 2 sons named Marcus and Caius, who speak better Latin than their father and have never been to Thrace. None of them exist in any legal document Rome recognizes as valid. Not yet. That is what the diploma is for. That is what is in the wooden box in the headquarters building 40 paces away. Everything that matters. His family's legal existence. Their names in the empire's registry. The confirmation in bronze that the 24 years were worth something. The diploma has not arrived. You think this is a story about old soldiers finally going home. Every textbook frames it that way. Brave men who served Rome received their reward and lived out their days in quiet dignity. That version of the story has survived 2,000 years because it was useful. It was the version Rome needed young men to believe on the day they signed their names. It was the version that made the machine run. The truth beneath it is stranger, colder, and in the end far more violent. Because the Roman military retirement system was not built out of gratitude. It was not built out of honor. It was not built because Rome loved the men who bled for it. It was built out of fear. Precise, calculated, institutionalized fear. Fear of what 400,000 armed, trained, and thoroughly organized men would do if they were never given a reason to stay loyal. And once you understand that, the diploma Dieguez is waiting for is not a reward but a containment strategy, you understand why the same machine that eventually gave him his bronze tablets also sold the throne of the Roman Empire to the highest bidder on a Tuesday afternoon with civilians watching from the street below and no one able to do anything about it. What we are going to trace in this video is the full machine. From the morning Augustus sat down with his treasury advisors and calculated exactly how much a human life of military service was worth to the afternoon, that same calculation completed its own logic and turned on the men who built it. We are going to follow one man through the system as it was designed to function. We are going to watch what happens when the machine encounters the first real shock to its structure. And we are going to end at the moment when Rome's retirement program stopped being an administrative system and became the most dangerous political instrument in the ancient world. This is not a story about soldiers going home. It is a story about what Rome built when it tried to solve the problem of home. The Rhine is gray this morning. The current moves fast near the bank where Dieguez stands watch, cold enough that the breath of the man beside him makes a small white cloud every few seconds. The smell coming off the river is mud and cold water, and somewhere beneath that, the faint rot of the reeds. The fort behind them is already awake. The smell of wood smoke from the cook fires has been building since before dawn. Somewhere inside the walls, a horse is nervous about something shifting its hooves on the stone of the stable floor in a rhythm that carries clearly in the quiet air. The sky is the particular gray of a late summer morning on the German frontier, the kind of gray that does not commit to becoming light, that holds the darkness a little longer than it needs to, as if reluctant to show what the day has planned. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now telling me what city and country you are watching from. And if you have not subscribed yet, hit subscribe. You are watching the best dark history channel in the world. Rome's imperial army at its full strength in the early 1st century was not a conscript force. This is the first thing to understand because it changes everything that follows. The men who filled the legions and the auxiliary cohorts were volunteers. They signed contracts. They negotiated in the limited way available to poor young men, negotiating with the largest bureaucratic military organization on earth the terms of their service. And the central term, the one that made everything else tolerable, was the promise at the end. Serve your full term, obey orders, survive. And Rome will pay. For a common legionary full term meant 20 years. For an auxiliary soldier like Diegus serving in a cohort recruited from a non-citizen province, full term meant 25. At the conclusion of that term, in assuming honorable service and no serious infractions, a soldier received what Rome called the premium militia, the military prize. For legionaries, this meant a cash payment of 12,000 sesterces, a sum representing roughly 13 years of base military salary concentrated into a single settlement. For auxiliaries, the prize was different and in certain ways more profound. It was not primarily cash. It was a bronze diploma, citizenship, legal existence, the formal transformation of a man who had been legally invisible into a man Rome recognized as fully real. The bargain had one other dimension that is easy to overlook. It cut in both directions. Serve with honor and receive the prize. Fail in discipline, desert your post, commit a serious offense, and lose everything. There was no partial credit, no negotiated settlement, no gradual scaling of benefits to years served. The system was binary in its design. Full compliance earned full reward. Anything less, and the machine moved on without you. This sounds straightforward. It was not. It was a brilliantly engineered loyalty mechanism disguised as a benefit program. This was not a welfare system. This was the most sophisticated loyalty purchase program the ancient world had ever assembled, and like all purchase programs, it worked exactly as long as the buyer kept paying. Consider what the binary structure actually accomplished. A soldier in year 12 of a 20-year commitment had already invested 12 years. He had nothing to show for those years yet, legally or financially. His cash payment was still 8 years away. His land grant was still 8 years away. His legal status as a veteran was still 8 years away. This meant that the closer he got to his discharge date, the more he had to lose by defecting, deserting, or causing trouble. The promise of the retirement prize was at its most powerful, not when a soldier first heard it, but in the final years of service when the payout was close enough to feel real, but still far enough that a single infraction could cost him everything. Rome had designed a compliance mechanism that grew stronger over time. The older and more experienced the soldier, the more tightly the machine held him. If you served in the United States military and left before reaching 20 years of service, you walked away with almost nothing in terms of pension. Hit that 20-year mark and you received a pension for life. That cliff, that precise, deliberate threshold between nothing and everything, is 2,000 years old. Rome invented it. Rome invented it not because it was fair, but because it worked. The years of service just before the cliff are the years of maximum compliance. The soldier closest to his discharge date is the soldier most committed to giving you no trouble. The promise does not just reward loyalty. In the final stretch, when it matters most, it manufactures it. The young men signing recruitment papers in towns across the empire in the early decades of the 1st century had no way to fully grasp this structure on the day they signed. They understood the basic terms. They understood that service was long and the reward was real. What they could not know, because it had not yet been tested, was whether the promise would hold under pressure. The machine existed on paper. It had functioned during the good years under emperors with stable treasuries, in periods when the political situation allowed for the orderly discharge of the men coming off their terms. Whether it would hold when circumstances changed, when the treasury was strained, when the emperor died suddenly and left the system to someone who had not built it, when the gap between what was owed and what was available became too wide to paper over with promises and postponements, that question was still open. They could not have known this. They signed anyway. Augustus understood the danger more clearly than anyone. He had spent 30 years watching what happened when military loyalty was personal rather than institutional, when soldiers fought for commanders rather than for Rome, when the promise of reward came from a man's mouth rather than from a system's ledger. He had watched Julius Caesar's army march on Rome. He had watched Mark Antony's legions fight against his own. He had watched the Italian countryside stripped of its farms to settle the veterans of civil wars fought for commanders who had since died or been killed or fled to Egypt. He had been one of the men making those promises, and he understood exactly how hollow they could become. The solution he reached in 6 AD was not generous. It was strategic. It was the aerarium militare, a dedicated military treasury ring fenced from the general imperial finances funded by two specific taxes, a 5% levy on inheritances and a 1% tax on public auction sales. For the first time in Roman history, the promise made to soldiers at recruitment was backed by an actual institutional fund rather than by the personal wealth and political will of the current commander. The promise had a vault behind it. The vault had a dedicated revenue stream. The system would outlast any individual emperor because it was no longer dependent on any individual emperor's solvency. Stand in the scribal offices of the Palatine in the year 6 AD, and the work being done there does not look like history, it looks like accounting. The smell of fresh papyrus and lamp oil, the scratch of iron on wax tablets, clerks working from census figures and military rosters, and mortality tables calculating the expected discharge obligations for the next decade, projecting the revenue from inheritance taxes against the anticipated payout schedule, building a spreadsheet for the cost of loyalty at scale. These men were not thinking about honor, they were thinking about actuarial risk. They were pricing the question of how much it cost per soldier per year to keep 400,000 armed men from becoming a political problem. The aerarium militare was not a fund for soldiers. It was an insurance premium paid by a civilization to its own armed population. Who paid for this premium? Roman civilians. The inheritance tax fell hardest on the senatorial and equestrian classes, the wealthiest citizens in the empire. It was deeply resented. Members of the Senate argued against it. Augustus pushed it through regardless. The calculation was transparent to anyone paying attention. Civilian Romans were being taxed to fund the loyalty of soldiers who, if they became disloyal, would threaten civilian Romans. The population that had the most to lose from military unrest was being asked to fund the system that prevented military unrest. This was not cynicism. This was Rome operating at the highest level of its administrative intelligence. Everybody in the system paid for the thing that protected them. Everybody understood at some level why they were paying. And the system held. It held because the math was correct. A discharged legionary with 12,000 sesterces in his belt was not a threat. He was a consumer, a taxpayer, a settler, a propagandist for the Roman way of life. He was in the most literal sense a return on investment. The aerarium military transformed military spending from a pure cost into a recycling mechanism. You paid soldiers to fight. You then paid them again to stop fighting to settle to become farmers and colonists and local strongmen who stabilized the provinces they were planted in. The second payment was smaller than the first in the long run because the second payment turned soldiers into assets rather than liabilities. Augustus had, in effect, put a price tag on every soldier's life, not what it cost to kill them in battle, what it cost to keep them from killing back. Before we follow that diploma system specifically, before we understand what those bronze tablets actually meant for men like Diegus, who had spent their entire adult lives waiting to hold them, we need to sit with what a soldier actually surrendered in order to earn that reward. Because the 12,000 sesterces in the diploma and the land grant and the citizenship, they only make sense when you understand the bill that Rome had been running up against the man's account for every year of service. When you understand what was taken, the return stops looking like generosity and starts looking like what it actually was. Roman soldiers on active service could not legally marry. This was not a suggestion, not a guideline, not a practical difficulty. It was a formal legal prohibition. A soldier under arms could not contract a valid Roman marriage. He could not take a wife in the eyes of Roman law. He could not have legitimate children in the eyes of Roman law. He could not establish a household in the eyes of Roman law. The intent behind this prohibition was not difficult to read. Rome wanted no competing loyalties. A man with a legal wife had a reason to go home. A man with legal children had a reason to survive at cost that might compromise his effectiveness as a soldier. Rome wanted men whose primary legal family was the legion. Everything else was unofficial. Everything else was outside the contract. This was the theory. The reality was different, as realities tend to be, when the theory requires 25-year-old men to have no emotional attachments for a quarter century. Camp towns, the Vici, that grew up outside the walls of every permanent Roman fort across the empire, were the living refutation of the prohibition. These civilian settlements existed to serve the military economy, and they were populated largely by the families. Soldiers were not permitted to officially have. Every soldier knew they existed. Every centurion knew they existed. Every legate knew they existed. Rome knew they existed. The prohibition remained in place regardless, because the prohibition was not about the soldiers. It was about the legal relationships those soldiers could form. A man could have a companion. He could have children. He simply could not have them in a way that gave them any legal claim on him or him any legal claim on them. His name could not appear on their birth records in any binding form. His death could not transfer property to them by right. In the eyes of the law, they were people who happened to live near him, connected by affection and practical arrangement, connected by everything that made a life meaningful, and connected by nothing that Rome was obligated to recognize. Diegus has 2 sons. Marcus is 12. Caius is 9. He named them both with Roman names, and if you asked him why, he would have had difficulty explaining it entirely. Something about the naming being a form of preparation, or perhaps of hope. He was giving them names that would fit inside the empire he was trying to give them access to. He was dressing them in an identity before they had the papers to back it up. Marcus and Caius are not legal Romans. They are the unregistered sons of an auxiliary soldier and a Germanic woman who is not by any Roman document his wife. When Diegus walks through the vicus in the evening and his sons call to him from outside Zia's door, the call does not carry legal weight. It carries only everything else. He cannot own property in his own name, cannot legally marry, cannot register his children as legitimate, cannot bring a legal case in a Roman court, cannot vote in any assembly that matters, cannot claim his son's labor or Zia's fidelity under any law Roman forces. He cannot pass his savings to his family by right if he dies tomorrow. He has been living this way with full awareness of it for 24 years because the alternative was to never have had any of it at all. What soldiers received in exchange for this suspension of legal personhood was not nothing. The legion gave a man a place in a ranked hierarchy where his position was clear and his obligations were defined. It gave him brothers in the way that only shared extremity can create brotherhood. It gave him a language, a set of shared references, a daily rhythm. It gave him, in the particular way of military life, a simplified version of existence where the fundamental questions were already answered. You know where you sleep. You know when you eat. You know who is above you and who is below. You know what is expected of you at any given hour of any given day. For a man who had grown up poor and unranked in a Thracian village, this was not a small thing. For a man whose civilian life had contained far more uncertainty than the army ever would, the legion's structure was not a cage. It was the first stable institution his existence had ever contained. The empire did not strip the soldier of his civilian life. Most of these men arrived without one worth naming. What Rome took was the possibility of building one during the years when a man has the most capacity to build. What Rome returned eventually on a specific afternoon at a formal ceremony with a tribune, reading names from a list, was a legal approximation of what other men had simply been born holding. Diegus had stopped thinking about Thrace somewhere around his 7th year of service. He noticed the absence the way you sometimes notice a missing tooth running your tongue across the gap at an unexpected moment. One evening, a newly recruited Thracian arrived in camp young enough to still have the village in his eyes, and said something in their shared language, a commonplace greeting. Diegus understood it immediately. He just had to pause before he could answer. Not because he had forgotten the words, because the words no longer arrived naturally. They had to be retrieved from somewhere behind his Latin, behind his soldier's German, behind the daily language of the Rhine frontier. The village was still in his memory. It had simply stopped being where he lived. The man who had enlisted at 18 was gone. What remained was a soldier with a Thracian accent and Roman calluses and no home in either direction. In that pause before answering, something was visible that Diegus would not have been able to name. A man caught between two identities belonging fully to neither. Not yet Roman, no longer Thracian, waiting in the specific way of men who have given everything to a future that has not yet arrived for a piece of bronze to tell him who he was. Before we step into the year 14 AD, before we follow what happens when the machine encounters the first real shock to its foundations, if you are still here, at this point in the story, you are not a casual viewer. You are someone who wants to understand how power actually functioned, not the marble surface of it, but the mechanism underneath the ledger entries, in the legal fictions, in the human lives that were consumed to keep the whole structure running. Members of this channel are the people who make this kind of history possible. They help determine which buried systems we drag into the light next. They are the reason we can go this deep. If that sounds like where you belong, consider joining. Because what is about to happen in the autumn of 14 AD will change everything about how Rome ran its army for the next 2 centuries. And it begins with a man dying 800 miles from the Rhine. A man whose death in the weeks that follow will freeze Diegus in place and extend his service beyond its legal end date and push the entire Rhine frontier to the edge of open war against itself. The military diploma was 2 bronze tablets, each roughly the size of a man's hand, bolted together along one edge so that they opened like a book and closed like a sealed case. The outer face carried a summary inscription. The inner face carried the full legal text, and the inner face was sealed after writing folded shut and tied and stamped so that it could not be altered without obvious evidence of tampering. The soldier kept the outer copy. A matching copy, word for word, character for character, was filed in Rome on the Capitoline Hill in the archive that held the empire's administrative memory. If there was ever a dispute about what the diploma said about whether the names on it were accurate, about whether the citizenship had actually been granted, the archive could be checked. Rome had engineered a tamper-evidence system into an object the size of a dinner plate because Rome understood that the thing these tablets represented was valuable enough to forge and valuable enough to protect. Over the lifespan of the empire, historians estimate that more than 250,000 of these diplomas were issued. Each one required a separate imperial authorization, a separate production by a skilled bronze worker, a separate filing in the Capitoline archive. This was not an informal gesture of goodwill toward faithful servants. This was an industrial process operating at scale, consuming significant administrative resources year after year across every frontier of the empire. Rome invested in this process because Rome understood what it was buying. What the diploma actually granted in specific legal language was this: Roman citizenship for the soldier himself, effective from the moment of his honorable discharge. Legal recognition of his existing union as a valid marriage under Roman law, retroactive to its beginning. Legitimization of his existing children and all children born to him thereafter. One object, one afternoon ceremony, one tribune, reading names from a prepared list, and an entire family's legal existence was transformed. Children who had been officially nameless were suddenly Roman citizens with a documented father. A woman who had been legally a companion was suddenly a wife with enforceable rights. The diploma did not merely reward the soldier, it restructured the lives of everyone connected to him in one administrative moment. This is where the system reveals its true architecture, and it is worth pausing here to look at it clearly. Rome did not issue diplomas because it had grown fond of its auxiliary soldiers. Auxiliary units recruited from non-citizen provincial populations served at lower cost than full legions. They were often stationed in or near their regions of origin, which simplified supply lines and reduced the disruption of relocation. Their discharge obligations were structured differently from legionary ones. And crucially, citizenship cost Rome almost nothing to produce in monetary terms. There was no treasury entry for the cost of adding a name to the rolls of Roman citizens. The act of granting citizenship was essentially free to the state, while the loyalty it purchased was enormous and long-lasting. Rome had discovered that for men who had no citizenship, citizenship was worth more than any salary. It was the one thing money could not buy for them, and Rome controlled the supply completely. Rome was minting citizens the way it minted coins, at a controlled rate, in a specific denomination, distributed through a channel Rome managed entirely to produce a specific economic outcome. The outcome was loyalty. The coin was a name on a bronze tablet. The mint was a legion's headquarters building on a cold frontier morning. Dieguez did not know that his diploma had already been cut. A bronze worker in the workshop attached to the headquarters building at Castrovetra had completed the inscription 6 weeks earlier. He had worked from a wax tablet reference copy, transferring the names carefully, checking each character twice before moving to the next. The outer inscription named Dieguez of Thrace, soldier of cohorts 2 Thracium, having served his full term with honor. It named Zia, his companion of many years, now recognized as his wife in the eyes of Roman law. It named Marcus and Caius, his sons, now Roman citizens. Their parentage acknowledged their legal existence formalized in the metal that would outlast the fort, the frontier, and the empire administering the document. The tablet sat in a wooden box alongside 11 others waiting for the formal discharge ceremony, scheduled for the end of the summer campaigning season. Dieguez walked past the headquarters building every morning on gate duty. He was one administrative event away from everything he had spent 24 years waiting for. He did not know this. He had learned over 2 decades of living in the gap between what was promised and what had arrived, not to count things he could not yet hold. Stand in the headquarters building at Castrovetra on the afternoon when the bronze worker finished the last tablet in the box. The smell of the place is metal shavings and lamp oil, in the particular dryness of a room with no windows lit from below by oil lamps that cast upward shadows on the faces of men bending over their work. The sound of a chisel on bronze is precise, controlled, almost musical in its rhythm when the worker is skilled. Each strike of the mallet is calibrated to move the metal without distorting it, to leave a clean letter that will still be legible when everyone in this room is long dead. The bronze worker sets down his tools, holds the tablet at an angle to the lamp, checks the inscription one final time and places it in the wooden box. He does not know the man whose name he has just made permanent. He will never meet him. Before we reach the ceremony where Dieguez was supposed to receive that box, before we understand why it did not happen on schedule, we need to travel 800 miles south to a town in Campania called Nola. Because on the 19th of August in the year 14 AD, something happened there that put every diploma in that box on hold, froze every pending discharge across the Rhine frontier, and set in motion the first real stress test the retirement machine had ever faced. Augustus died at Nola on the 19th of August, 14 AD. He was 75 years old. He had been emperor in everything but the formal title that the Republic's ghost still made it impolitic to claim since the Battle of Actium. In 31 BC, he had been, for the entirety of his reign, the only emperor anyone in the army had ever served under. A soldier who enlisted in the year 10 BC, the year Dieguez signed his papers, had never known anything but Augustus. The Principate was not to such a man an abstract system of government. It was a man. It was the man whose name was on the diploma, whose authority stood behind every promise made at recruitment, whose face appeared on the coins the soldier received on payday. When Augustus died, the system he had built did not automatically die with him. But its first test, the test of whether it could transfer intact from one man to another, was now unavoidable. Tiberius succeeded him. He was competent, experienced, and deeply unpopular in the way that serious, uncharismatic men in positions requiring constant public performance tend to be unpopular. He had spent decades in Augustus's shadow, been sent into exile, been recalled, been designated heir, and had arrived at the position of emperor carrying the cold demeanor of a man who had waited too long for something he had mixed feelings about receiving. He was not a bad administrator. He was not a cruel man by the standards of his time and position. He was, however, immediately confronted with a set of financial obligations that Augustus had left him without adequate provision to meet. The aerarium military was not at the time of Augustus's death in a position to cover the full schedule of pending discharges. A significant cohort of men across the Rhine and Danube frontiers had reached or were approaching the end of their service terms. The discharge bonuses owed to these men represented a substantial obligation. Tiberius, inheriting a treasury that had been drawn upon heavily in the final years of his predecessor's reign, made a decision that was financially reasonable and politically catastrophic. He ordered temporary extensions of service terms across the affected frontiers while the new administration stabilized. No discharge ceremonies until further notice. No diploma distributions until further notice. The obligation was not canceled. It was deferred. Tiberius understood that an unpaid veteran was a liability. He had done the basic calculation. What he had not calculated was the compound interest of delay, because he had never stood in the ranks waiting for a diploma, and he did not understand what the men on the Rhine had spent 25 years watching for. They were not watching the horizon for Germanic raiders. They had centurions for that. They were watching the administrative calendar for the discharge ceremony that would end their service and begin their legal existence. They had been watching for years. Some of them had been watching for longer than their original term, having been pressured into re-enlistments or extension agreements that had quietly added years to their original commitment without adding proportionally to their pay. They had watched other men receive their diplomas and walk away. They had waited their turn. And now an administrator in Rome, a man who had never marched the Rhine in winter, had decided that their turn would have to wait a little longer while the new government got its accounts in order. At Castra Vetera, a centurion called Diegas's unit to morning formation and read the order without elaboration. The discharge ceremony was postponed pending administrative review. No date had been set for rescheduling. They were to continue normal duties until further notice. The centurion folded the wax tablet and walked away without questions. Diegas stood in the gray morning air and said nothing. He reported for gate duty. He checked the perimeter. He ate his ration. He had been doing these things for 24 years, and he did them now with the same economy of movement as always, because doing anything else would have accomplished nothing. That night in Zia's house in the Vicus, he told her the ceremony had been postponed. She asked how long. He said he didn't know. She looked at Marcus, who was sitting near the fire pretending not to listen, and then at Caius, who was already asleep. She did not ask again. Diegas watched her face while she decided not to ask again, and understood that she was doing the same calculation he was doing, the one about what it meant for the boys, the one about names and legal existence, and what happened to their claim on any something if the diploma continued to not arrive. He did not sleep well. He lay in the dark listening to the river, which did not care about any of this, and ran the numbers until the trumpet sounded at dawn. Step back and look at what was accumulating on the Rhine in the late summer and early autumn of 14 AD. There were roughly 4 legions stationed along the lower Rhine, somewhere between 20 and 25,000 legionary soldiers, plus their associated auxiliary units. A significant portion of these men had reached or passed the end of their contracted service terms. They were still in uniform, still under orders, still sleeping in their assigned barracks, still subject to the vine staff of every centurion who chose to use it. They had given Rome what Rome asked for. Rome had not yet given them what Rome had contracted to give back. And every man in those forts had spent his entire career learning one skill above all others: how to coordinate organized action among large groups of men toward a specific objective. They were armed. They were trained. They were organized by the same hierarchy that Rome had built to make them effective against external enemies. And they were being made to wait by a new emperor they had not chosen for a financial reason. No one had explained, with no date attached to the delay. The century of soldiers, who would later be remembered primarily as a disciplined instrument of Roman expansion, were in this specific moment a critical mass of organized grievance. Rome had built them to hold. In the autumn of 14 AD, what they were holding was their patience, and it was running out. The first open break came in the legionary barracks at Castra Vetera. It did not begin with a plan. It began with a man named Persenius. Tacitus records him as a former theater contractor, a man who had spent years organizing crowds for public entertainment before enlisting a man who knew how to read a room and understood that what a crowd needed was not an argument, but a voice that said out loud what everyone in the room was already thinking. Persenius stood up in the barracks and he spoke. His argument was precise, and it was not wrong. We give 30 years of our lives. We give them not as free men offering a service, but as men under the vine staff, subject to beatings for infractions that a civilian would address with a fine. Our pay is 10 copper coins a day before all the deductions that reduce it to less. We buy our own clothing from our own wages. We pay for our own equipment replacements. We are told that discharge awaits at the end of service, and then we are told to wait without explanation, without a date, while the men who have taken everything we had to give confer in Rome about what they can afford to return. The barracks heard him, and then the barracks moved. 2 tribunes were beaten badly enough that neither would forget it. Several centurions were thrown out of the building by soldiers who had spent years absorbing punishment from them and had decided that the direction of violence could be reversed. The camp prefect, the senior administrative officer of the fort, was dragged to the rampart above the Rhine and thrown over into the water below. He survived. Barely. He did not return to command the fort. Inside the walls, torches came out after dark. The centurion's quarters lost their roofs to fire. The century that Rome had designed as an instrument of control had turned that instrument around and was examining what it looked like from the other end. Diegis's unit, Cohors II Thracium, was auxiliary. They were stationed in a separate compound inside the same fort complex under their own chain of command, separate in the organizational structure from the legionary units now in open mutiny. His centurion kept the auxiliary cohorts in formation in their compound. This was not their mutiny. The correct thing to do was to maintain order and wait for the situation to resolve. Diegus stood in the compound with his century and watched the smoke rise from the legionary section of the fort, and thought about the wooden box in the headquarters building, and thought about Marcus asleep near the fire, and thought about the distinction between what was technically happening and what was actually true. What was technically happening was that the legions were mutinying and his cohort was not. What was actually true was that his diploma was in the same building being managed by the same administration, waiting on the same order from the same emperor who had decided to make everyone wait. The distinction between not mutinying and agreeing completely with the reasons for the mutiny was a line he was standing on carefully, and he was aware of exactly where his feet were. In Rome, the grievances pouring in from the Rhine were being received with something that moved through alarm toward dread. This was not a small unit refusing an order. This was multiple full legions on the empire's most critical northern frontier in a state of organized defiance. The generals who had tried to manage the situation locally had already failed. There was one man Rome trusted to walk into those forts and bring them back, and his name was Germanicus. Germanicus was the adopted son of Tiberius and the most beloved military figure in the empire. He was handsome, charismatic, and genuinely popular with soldiers in the way that very few commanders ever managed to be, the kind of popular that comes not from performance, but from being seen and recognized by the men in the ranks as someone who understands what the ranks actually are. He arrived at the Rhine camp in person with his family, and that detail matters because arriving with your wife and children is a specific kind of statement in a situation where men are angry about their own families having no legal status. His options were not good. He could not order a massacre at this scale without destroying the Rhine defense entirely. He could not wait the situation out with winter approaching and the Germanic frontier requiring active garrisoning. He could not simply agree to everything the soldiers wanted without authorization from Tiberius, because agreeing to everything without authorization was technically insubordination and would hand his political enemies in Rome a weapon against him. What he actually did was something that has the quality of a decision made by a man who has assessed his options and concluded that all of them are bad and one of them is less bad than the others. He produced a letter from Tiberius granting the full demands. The letter's authenticity was at minimum ambiguous. He paid the outstanding discharge bonuses partially from his own personal funds, drawing on his inheritance to cover what the aerarium militare could not immediately produce. He ordered the release of soldiers who had served past their terms effective immediately. He issued the orders, he paid the money, and he sent a report to Rome explaining what he had done. Tiberius received that report and immediately understood what it meant. His most celebrated general, the man the soldiers loved more than they had ever loved, Tiberius, had just paid the Rhine army from his own personal wealth because the imperial treasury could not cover the obligation on schedule. The most powerful and wealthy organized state on earth had nearly lost its northern frontier because it had delayed a contractual payment to men who had already made their own payment in full in years and in the particular currency that cannot be returned. Tiberius approved Germanicus's actions publicly. He confirmed the discharges. He honored the commitments. In private, he began looking for a way to move Germanicus away from the Rhine command. A general who could purchase legionary loyalty out of his own pocket was precisely the kind of general who made emperors uncomfortable, because emperors had recently learned what happened when a general's personal loyalty could substitute for the state's institutional loyalty. They had all read what happened to Julius Caesar's opponents once Caesar's army decided their loyalty was to him and not to Rome. Germanicus had not fixed the machine. He had purchased another interval of loyalty at personal expense. The machine was still running, but it was running on private credit extended by a man whose popularity with the troops was itself becoming a political problem. And credit in a system built entirely on the belief that institutions honor their commitments is a specific and irreversible kind of damage. You can repay the money. You cannot repay the demonstration that the money was necessary in the first place. Every politician in the history of organized democracy since Rome has understood the same calculation Germanicus was running at the Rhine in the autumn of 14 AD. Veterans are not just former soldiers. They are organized, they are credible, they carry the moral authority of demonstrated sacrifice, and they remember exactly what was promised, and exactly what was delivered, and exactly how long the gap between the two lasted. The distance between honored veterans and dangerous veterans is precisely the distance between a kept promise and a broken one. You appear at the Veterans Hall not because you love them, but because the alternative is finding out whether they have found someone else to love. The discharge ceremonies happened in stages over the following weeks. Diegis's came 3 weeks after the legionary releases at a ceremony that was efficient and impersonal in the way of administrative events that have been delayed and are now being processed in volume. A tribune he had never spoken to called his name from a list and handed him a wooden box. Diegis took it without ceremony. He walked from the headquarters building through the fort gate and along the road to the Vicus and found Zisia at the door of her house with Marcus and Caius beside her. He opened the box. He held the outer tablet in both hands in the morning light and read his name. He read Zia's name. He read Marcus. He read Caius. He sat down on the low stone wall at the edge of the road and held the tablet for a long time without speaking. Zia stood next to him and did not interrupt whatever was happening in the silence. The river was behind them. The fort trumpet was behind that, already beginning in some quality of the sound it made to be part of a world he was leaving. His sons stood at the edge of the road, watching their father hold a piece of metal and not speak, and neither of them asked what it said because they understood in the particular way that children who have grown up near something important understand it, that this was not the moment for questions. Marcus and Caius, Roman, documented, real. Before we follow Diegis away from that Rhine bank and watch what Rome intended to do with him next, and it did intend something very specific with him, because Rome was never finished with the men it had made, we need to understand that the diploma in his hands was not the end of the machine's interest in him. It was a reassignment document. The form of his usefulness to Rome had changed. His function had not. Rome did not plant its veterans randomly. The empire had specific destinations in mind for the men coming off its frontier armies, and those destinations were chosen with the same cold calculation that had governed every other aspect of military life. The veteran colony system formally established settlements founded with discharged soldiers as their first citizen population was one of the most effective instruments of imperial consolidation ever developed, and it was effective precisely because it looked nothing like a military operation. Consider what a colony of 300 veterans actually was. It was a grid-planned town laid out by military engineers on the same geometric principles used for camp construction, built on land that had been either recently conquered, recently pacified, or identified as strategically critical to hold. Its population was composed of men who had spent 20 or 25 years internalizing Roman administrative practice, Roman legal culture, Roman building methods, Roman agricultural techniques, and the Latin language at a functional level. These men had no financial reason to go anywhere else because their land tenure, their citizenship status, and their children's legal standing were all anchored to the settlement. They had no social reason to go anywhere else because their entire network was there, the men they had served with, the families those men had brought with them. And they had no political reason to go anywhere else because the continued security of their settlement depended on the continued expansion and stability of the empire that had granted it to them. The colony did what a garrison legion could never do. The garrison had to be fed, supplied, paid, and eventually replaced. It was a cost that renewed itself indefinitely. The colony was self-sustaining. It produced its own food, generated its own tax revenue, trained its own sons for future military service, and spread Roman cultural and legal practice into the surrounding population through commerce, intermarriage, and the simple daily demonstration of how Romans organized their lives. Colonia Augusta Praetoria at the critical Alpine pass that controlled access between Italy and the northern provinces was built this way. Colonia Claudia Ara Agrippinensium on the Rhine at the point the frontier most needed. Anchoring built on the same principle, the town that would eventually become Cologne. Colonia Julia Carthago, planted in the ruins of the city Rome had burned to the ground, populated with Italian veterans as its first citizens, a statement in flesh and bone about the permanence of Roman victory. These were not towns built for the comfort of retired soldiers. They were strategic installations built from retired soldiers. In the defense economy of the modern United States, there are towns whose entire economic structure has been rebuilt around a military base. The hospital exists to serve the base. The housing market exists to serve the base. The local contractors exist to serve the base. When a base closes, the town does not simply lose an employer. It loses the organizing principle of its existence. Rome built this dependency deliberately and inverted it. The veterans in a colony were not dependent on the military installation for economic survival. They were the military installation transformed into civilian form. Their economic survival depended on Rome maintaining the infrastructure and legal framework that made their land grants and citizenship real. They became, without being asked or instructed, the most reliable advocates for Roman expansion and stability in any region they settled, because Roman expansion and stability were the conditions of their own continued existence. Diegus accepted a land allocation in a settlement being established in the Rhine Valley not far from the fort complex where he had served. He had the legal right to return to Thrace. Some men did. Men with families still living there, with a language still functioning in their mouths, with roots that had survived 25 years of absence. Diegus understood, sitting in the administrator's office, reviewing the options, that Thrace was a word in his memory and a direction on a map. The Rhine was where his son's Latin was clear and fluent, and where Zia's family were, and where he knew the paths between the settlements and the names of the men running the local market, in the particular way the light came off the water in the early morning of the season when the mist was still on the river. He signed the allocation papers for the Rhine Valley land. Later, when he tried to explain the decision to himself, it came out sounding like it had been freely made, which it had been. The machine had worked exactly as intended. It had colonized him so thoroughly that the colony felt like home, which was the deepest success the whole apparatus had ever achieved. He drove his first boundary stake into the Rhine Valley earth on a morning in late autumn. The ground was not yet fully frozen, but it was resistant in the way of ground that is thinking about it. The sound of the mallet on the stake carried in the cold air. A child called out from somewhere across the cleared field, one of his own sons running the perimeter of what was going to become the kitchen garden, shouting in the Latin that came easier to him than it ever had to his father, the Latin of a Roman citizen who had been born Roman and did not yet know that the papers had once almost not arrived. Before we zoom out to the full scale of what this machine built across 2 centuries, before we see the moment when the entire system completed its own logic in an extraordinary afternoon, in Rome there is a book that sits at the foundation of everything in this video. The history you have been hearing today is drawn from primary sources, from Tacitus's Annals, from Suetonius, from the material record of the bronze diplomas themselves, from the inscriptions on veteran settlement monuments. If you want to go deeper into the documentary record behind this kind of history, into the actual administrative texts and legal frameworks that govern Roman military life, the link is in the description. It is not casual reading. It is dense and exact, and it will change the way you look at every other aspect of Roman history you have ever encountered. Open the shelf while the story continues, because what happens next is the moment the machine turned on the people who built it. March the 28th, 193 AD, the Emperor Pertinax has been dead for 3 hours. He died inside the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, killed by a group of Praetorian soldiers who had entered the palace grounds under the pretense of a complaint about their pay. Pertinax had walked out to meet them personally, which was either enormously brave or a catastrophic misreading of the situation, and had spoken to them directly and had been killed anyway. He had been emperor for 87 days. Before that, he had been a competent general and a capable administrator. He had tried in his 87 days to restore fiscal discipline to an imperial treasury that his predecessor, Commodus, had spent with a consistency bordering on dedication. Part of that fiscal discipline had involved reducing the irregular bonuses and payments that the Praetorian Guard had come to expect as a condition of their loyalty. The Praetorians had noted this reduction and drawn a conclusion that Pertinax had perhaps not anticipated clearly enough. The conclusion was that he was not worth what the next man might offer. Now the Praetorians are in their camp on the northeastern edge of Rome. The camp is a brick-walled installation large enough to quarter the entirety of the guard, roughly 10,000 soldiers within Rome's city boundary. They are in their camp, they are in their armor, they have just killed a sitting emperor in the middle of the afternoon, and they are standing with the empire in the room trying to decide what to do with it. What they do is open an auction. This requires a moment to absorb. They opened an auction for the position of Emperor of Rome, publicly, with two identified bidders and soldiers acting as the auctioning party and the throne of the largest empire on earth as the lot. The two bidders were Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator who arrived at the camp gates after hearing news of Pertinax's death and calculating, apparently with some speed, that this was a moment for action. The other bidder was Sulpicianus, the city prefect of Rome, and with a particular cruelty of circumstance, the father-in-law of the man the Praetorians had killed 3 hours earlier. Sulpicianus had reached the camp slightly ahead of Julianus and had entered through the gates and had already begun making offers from inside the walls. Julianus arrived at the gates and found them closed. He began shouting his competing offers over the rampart. Stand in the street outside the Praetorian camp on that afternoon, and the smell is still iron and blood, and the particular sharpness of a city where something has gone wrong, and everyone who can smell it is trying to determine the direction. The crowd that gathered outside the camp walls was silent in the specific way that people are silent when they are watching something they have no framework for, something for which their entire understanding of the world has not prepared them. They were Roman citizens watching their constitution dissolve in real time, watching the office that organized their entire political existence being bartered over a wall by soldiers in armor, while the body of the man who had held that office an hour ago was cooling inside a palace a mile away. The shouting of the two men over the wall, each one escalating his offer as the Praetorians inside conferred and signaled, carried to the crowd. The crowd did not cheer. The crowd did not protest. The crowd watched. Didius Julianus won. His winning bid was 25,000 sesterces per man to be distributed to every soldier in the guard. Hold that number against what you know. Augustus had established the standard legionary discharge bonus at 12,000 sesterces in 6 AD, a payment that represented 13 years of base salary and was designed to be generous enough to seem like a real reward while remaining fiscally sustainable as a recurring institutional obligation. The Praetorians had just extracted a payment per man of more than twice that standard, not as a retirement bonus paid at the end of a career, not as a reward for 20 years of service, but as an accession payment collected from a man who had not yet served a single day as emperor in exchange for the privilege of being permitted to begin. The price of the empire had been set by the men with the swords, and the men with the swords had set it at a rate that made Augustus's entire actuarial framework look like a preliminary sketch. Julianus was escorted to the Senate, which confirmed his appointment with the enthusiasm of a body that understood it had been presented with a choice between confirmation and whatever came after refusal. He became emperor of Rome. He lasted 66 days. The soldiers who had killed one emperor opened a public auction for his office, collected a payment larger than any standard discharge bonus in Roman history, confirmed a second emperor through the armed management of the Senate's deliberations, and then watched 3 frontier armies march on Rome simultaneously in response to what had happened. These men were not criminals operating outside the system. They were not barbarians who had broken through the walls. They were Roman soldiers trained by the Roman military apparatus, operating according to the logic the Roman military apparatus had spent 2 centuries teaching them. They were the retirement machine at full operational capacity. They were the system completing its own argument. The soldiers who killed one emperor, sold his throne to another, took a payment worth more than a decade of standard salary, confirmed their purchase through senatorial duress, and then watched the empire enter a civil war over the consequences. These men were not failures of the Roman system. They were its graduates. Every one of them had learned from the same institution that taught Diagus to wait for his diploma. They had simply updated the price and moved the transaction. To see the full chain, you have to step back 2 centuries and watch all the links at once. Augustus establishes the Aerarium Militare in 6 AD. He has formalized for the first time in Roman history that military loyalty has a specific price, that this price is institutionally guaranteed, and that the guarantee is backed by a ring-fenced fund with a dedicated revenue stream. The principle is now in the architecture: loyalty follows payment, payment follows service, service creates an obligation. The obligation must be honored or the system breaks. 14 AD, Tiberius delays the payment. The Rhine legions demonstrate through organized violence against their own officers that the obligation is real and the soldiers know it is real, and they have the capacity to enforce it when the institution defaults. Germanicus responds by paying out of his own pocket, which demonstrates a second principle that will matter enormously. The institutional obligation can be substituted by a personal one. A sufficiently wealthy and popular individual can perform the function of the state in this specific transaction. The machine notes this. Over the following century and a half, the Praetorian Guard stationed in Rome itself, uniquely positioned to manage the transitions between emperors, absorbs both principles. Loyalty follows payment. Personal payment can substitute for institutional payment. The next step is logical and inevitable. If a sufficiently wealthy individual can purchase the loyalty that the institution provides, and if the institution is the emperor, and if the emperor is the wealthiest individual available, then the position of emperor is at its functional core, the position of the person most able to meet the guard's price. The guard does not need to wait for soldiers to age out of service and collect their terminal bonuses. The guard can collect at the front end. They can set the price at accession rather than at discharge. They can turn the terminal payment into an entry fee. This is not a corruption of the system Augustus designed. This is the system Augustus designed and applied by intelligent men who had been trained by that system to understand that organized collective action produces results that individual action cannot, operating on a new variable. Augustus had tried to prevent armies from being loyal to individual commanders by making them loyal to institutional processes instead. He had succeeded. The Praetorian Guard in 193 AD was not loyal to Pertinax. It was loyal to the process of payment. It was loyal to the institution of the discharge bonus, generalized and accelerated. Augustus had moved loyalty from persons to systems. The system had found a new buyer. The buyer was whoever could meet the current price. And that price, once it had been publicly demonstrated as negotiable, could only move in one direction. Septimius Severus, who marched on Rome from his Danubian command at the head of his legions and defeated the other civil war claimants, and had Julianus executed and took the throne, understood what had just happened with a clarity that no previous emperor had been willing to articulate. His reported advice to his sons, given from his deathbed in 211 AD at Eboracum in the far north of Britain, distilled 2 centuries of imperial administration into a single instruction: enrich the soldiers, scorn everyone else. This is not cynicism. This is diagnosis. Severus had watched what happened when the machine was not fed and had decided that feeding it was the only governance strategy that mattered. He raised military pay by 50%, the first significant pay increase in nearly a century. He permitted soldiers to legally marry for the first time in the history of the Roman military, ending the formal fiction that had organized military legal life since the Republic, the fiction that men under arms had no families, no wives, no legitimate children, no competing loyalties. The viti were real, the camp wives were real, the children were real. Severus made them legally real. Somewhere in the barracks of a frontier fort in the early 3rd century, a soldier sits at a table and eats a meal with his legal wife and their registered children. This scene, which would have been impossible for Diegus, which would have been a legal impossibility for every auxiliary soldier who spent 25 years waiting for a diploma to make his family real, is now unremarkable. It is Tuesday. The children are arguing about something. The wife is telling one of them to eat. This is what a successful social reform looks like from the inside. The men who benefited from it had no way to see what it had cost. What it had cost was the deferred loyalty mechanism that made the original system run at sustainable speed. The diploma at the end of the tunnel worked because it was at the end of the tunnel. A soldier in year 12 of 25 had invested 12 years and had nothing to show for it yet, and had 13 years still ahead, and had therefore 13 years more reason to comply to avoid infractions, to make himself the kind of soldier who would eventually receive his diploma with honor, rather than the kind who would lose it for a single serious offense. The delay was the mechanism. The waiting was the loyalty. Take away the waiting, make everything immediate and legal from the beginning of service, and you have not simply been more generous. You have removed the governor from the engine. Soldiers with legal families from day one had immediate political stakes. They did not need to wait 25 years to have something Rome could threaten to take away. They had it now, which meant they cared now about which emperor held power not in 15 years when their discharge came due, but this week, this month, in this succession crisis unfolding on the other side of the empire. The machine that had run on deferred reward now ran on immediate interest. An immediate interest, unmediated by the patience that only comes from waiting for something you cannot yet hold, operates at a speed that makes deliberate governance very difficult. Septimius Severus believed he had made the machine stronger by making its promises real in the present tense. He had removed the last friction, keeping it from running at full speed. Those are not the same thing. From the accession of the Emperor Maximinus Thrax in 235 AD to the accession of Diocletian in 284 AD, Rome had 26 emperors. Not all sources agree on the precise number because some of them held power so briefly and in such contested circumstances that their status as emperors at all is a matter of scholarly discussion. 26 emperors in approximately 50 years means an average reign of less than 2 years. Most were elevated by their own armies. Most were killed by the same. The Antonine period, the century preceding the crisis of the 3rd century, had featured emperors who reigned for decades and died in bed. The transition between those two eras is a single straight line drawn from the principle Augustus established in 6 AD and followed to its terminus. The Roman Empire did not collapse because its armies were weak. The legions of the 3rd century were as effective in the field as their predecessors. The logistics were not worse. The individual soldiers were not less capable. The empire was being compressed by the weight of a military that had been taught correctly that loyalty followed payment in a political environment where the payment could no longer be guaranteed by any single emperor, long enough to establish the kind of institutional continuity that makes deferred promises credible. The machine was running perfectly. It was running the empire into the ground by running perfectly, by doing exactly what it had been designed to do in a context its designer had not anticipated because he had not lived long enough to see it. Diegus died in approximately 29 AD on the Rhine Valley land at an age somewhere around 57. He had received his full payment, eventually the delay covered over by the administrative processing that followed the mutiny settlement delivered without ceremony by a junior officer who could not have known that the delay had cost anything beyond the waiting. He died a Roman citizen. His sons were Roman citizens. His land passed to Marcus through a will registered in the correct legal form, which was the thing the diploma had made possible, the thing 24 years of waiting had been in service of. The transfer of property from father to son through a document that Rome recognized. The smallest and most essential thing. Marcus joined the legions around 32 AD legally with his citizenship documented and his parentage acknowledged. He served honorably. His son Diegus' grandson served in the mid-1st century. The line continued in the Roman military in the way that lines do when the military is the most stable path available to men of a certain background and a certain set of skills. By the time of the 3rd century crisis, the descendants of the Thracian auxiliary who had stood on the Rhine bank in the autumn of 14 AD, holding his diploma, were almost certainly wearing Roman armor somewhere on one of the empire's shrinking frontiers, serving the same machine, waiting for the same promises. In a time when the emperor those promises were meant to protect was lasting an average of less than 2 years before dying at the hands of the men he was supposed to own. The machine had been trusted and the machine had delivered. And the descendants of the man who had trusted it were feeding it still at the moment when the feeding had become the destruction. Somewhere in the Rhine Valley between what is now the Netherlands and Germany, there may be a stone, a funeral stele, a boundary marker, a dedication tablet set in the earth by a man, or by the son of a man, or by whoever was left at the end. It might carry a Thracian name. It might say citizen. It almost certainly no longer says Thracian. The stone, if it exists, does not know what it helped to build. Tell me in the comments before we close what city and country you are watching from today. And tell me this, if you had given 25 years to a system that then delayed your payment without explanation, what would you have done? Would you have stood in formation and waited the way Diegus did, counting on the machine to eventually keep its word? Or would you have been in the barracks the night Persenia stood up and found a voice for what everyone in the room was already thinking? I want to know your answer. Drop it below and tell me which buried Roman system you want this channel to investigate next, because there are more of them, and some of them are even darker than this one. If this video gave you something, hit the like button. It is the single most effective thing you can do to help the algorithm push real history to people who want to find it. Hit subscribe if you have not already, because there is a great deal more coming. Share this video with someone who still thinks Rome was primarily about marble columns and gladiatorial spectacle. The marble was a surface, underneath it was accounting. Underneath the accounting was this. Augustus built this machine to solve one specific problem. How do you keep 400,000 armed men loyal when the fighting stops? The answer he found was elegant. You do not keep them loyal to you. You keep them loyal to a promise. You make the promise real enough and specific enough and valuable enough that men who are capable of organized violence will endure anything to reach it. You give the promise an institutional foundation. You put a vault behind it. You put a revenue stream behind the vault. You make the promise bigger than any individual, including yourself, so that it survives you and transfers intact and keeps running after you are gone. And it worked. For 2 generations, it worked with a precision that is genuinely impressive if you can look at it without the knowledge of what came next. The soldiers marched. They waited 20 and 25 years in legal suspension, without wives and without documented children and without property rights and without a legal name that Rome fully recognized. They waited because the promise was real, because the bronze was in the box, because other men had received it and walked away with their families made whole by a document the size of 2 joined tablets. They waited because the machine had been built to make waiting seem not only tolerable but rational. And then the machine ran long enough and far enough that the men inside it understood it better than the men who had built it. They understood that the promise was not a gift. It was a transaction. That the transaction had a price. That the price was negotiable. That the men holding the swords were the ones ultimately setting the terms. Augustus had spent his life watching what happened when soldiers were loyal to men rather than to systems. He had watched Julius Caesar's army march on Rome. He had watched the Republic destroyed by commanders whose legions would follow them into treason because the men trusted the commander more than they trusted the institution. He had dedicated his political genius to replacing personal loyalty with institutional loyalty to building something that would outlast any individual general, any individual emperor, any individual act of charisma or terror or bribery. He had succeeded completely. He had moved military loyalty from persons to processes. He had made it systematic and transferable and available to anyone who could meet the price. He had built a market. And on a March afternoon in 193 AD, on a wall in Rome with civilians watching from the street below, the market found its clearing price. The soldiers on that Praetorian wall were not betraying Augustus's system. They had understood it better than anyone. They were the machine completing the argument that had been running since the morning in 6 AD, when the first clerk sat down with a wax tablet and a mortality table and began calculating the cost of keeping an empire from turning on itself. The argument was simple. It had always been simple. Loyalty follows payment. Rome had taught this to every man who ever signed a recruitment from the Danube to the Sahara to the edge of Scotland. Rome had backed it with bronze and with institutions and with law. The soldiers on the wall had learned the lesson. They had simply asked the logical next question. If loyalty follows payment, who is paying and what are they paying for? Diegus knew. He had known since the morning he held his diploma on the Rhine bank and sat on the low stone wall and did not speak for a long time. He knew what the bronze weighed. He knew what had purchased it. He was not thinking about emperors on that morning. He was thinking about his sons' names written in metal that would outlast him. He was thinking about Zia standing next to him in the cold air. He was thinking about 24 years and what 24 years bought and whether it had been worth it, and that the question of whether it had been worth it was one he was not going to answer out loud. Not on this morning, not with the river behind him and the fort trumpet already beginning to sound like something from another life. He put the diploma back in the wooden box. He closed the lid. He stood up. He picked up the box and carried it home.